You'll have to forgive me as I'm moving positions constantly because I'm kind of ending my sort of little excerpt here. And after this, just going to start using my novel. So currently in the novel, I'm on page 6 and 7. Pages 6 and 7. So this is actually page 7 here. We're getting towards the end here. So now that they have found this tower tunnel, there's no way they can tell them about this discovery. And it's very interesting that she can't use any technology. It's very interesting that Vandermeer kind of makes a statement about this, right? He says it is ironic, and ironic meaning that it's something that you would never think of that a biologist would say. Because what does she say? I knew from experience how hopeless this pursuit, this attempt to weed out bias was. Nothing that lived and breathed was truly objective. Even in a vacuum, even if all that possessed the brain was a self-emulating desire for the truth, she's saying that people would still be, uh, they could not be as objective as they wanted. So Vandermeer makes a sort of interesting connection here. Typically, a biologist will always go with something that is called the scientific method, in which you test out a theory or a hypothesis, and then you back it up with some of your theories. And of course, you do the experiment, you analyze it, and then you present your results and conclusions. Sound familiar? That's right. Partially, the scientific method certainly inspires writing essays. So keep that in mind. And so he says the scientific method, which is generally intended to be as objective as possible in order to reduce biased interpretation of results. So, for example, rather than saying, well, I don't like to talk about this sort of topic, this is not something I believe in. The biologists may not believe in some of the things that they study, but they do it anyway with an objective point of view because they have to get a point across. So, for example, someone who studies human cells may be asked to look at COVID-19 like a virologist, someone who studies viruses, right? And that might not be what it is that they like to do, but it may be something that they are asked to do, right? So it's very important that in this case, the irony is even further in that because of the strange restrictions, they are no longer observers like researchers, right? There's a saying called a control group in biology, and this is also used in the social sciences. You have something called a control group in which you give them very strict restrictions, and you're telling them, okay, based on these factors, this is the results that we expect to get from them. In this case, when they go into Area X, they don't control anything. In fact, what does it say above? Desolation tries to colonize you. Nature appears, at least throughout this novel, nature appears to have the upper hand in terms of power, in terms of control. So when they come into this Area X, they are not seeing it as observers, like she mentioned earlier, which is to figure out more about it. In fact, she is going to be more like a participant, right? She's part of the control group. She may not see it that way, but that's the way that Vandermeer is putting it, right? And so as a result, it's only fitting that she will not be as objective as she says. And later on, she talks about that the fact that regardless of how you are, there's no way you can be objective in this case. So being subjective to your emotions is going to play a huge part in what goes on in this novel. And that is certainly the case when she talks about her husband, starting in chapter 2 and again going into chapter 3, 4, and 5 at the end of the novel. I'm excited by this discovery, the psychologist interjected, before we had discussed the tower much further. Are you excited too? Why would she ask that question? Again, what does the psychologist do? They often look at individuals, so they're looking for certain responses, right? What are the people going to react to? So she says, "Are you excited too?" During training, she had tended to ask questions like, "How calm do you think you'll be in an emergency?" Back then, I had felt as she were some bad actor playing a role. Now it seemed even more apparent, as if being our leader somehow made her nervous. I said, "It's definitely exciting and unexpected," trying not to mock her, and failing a little bit. I was surprised to feel a sense of growing unease, mostly because in my imagination, my dreams, this discovery would have been one of the more regular or not as important. In my head, before we had crossed the border, I had seen so many things: vast cities, peculiar animals, and once during a period of illness, an enormous monster that rose from the waves to bear down on our camp. Okay, let's stop there for a second. This is very, very, very important. As I mentioned earlier, she has been conditioned, which she mentions a little bit further on into chapter 1. She's being conditioned. Therefore, some of the things that she's seeing or imagining in her mind are things that are actually being told to her by the psychologist and people at the Southern Reach, right? So, in a way, she's being controlled into seeing these visions. But at the same time, she's making this appear as if it were more like a dream than a reality. But even though we don't understand how she came across the border, this foreshadows or lets us know that when she came here, many different things were there. Vast cities were there, which means human life used to be there, may not be there anymore. Peculiar animals, very odd creatures, which can mean a lot of different things. And during a period of illness, an enormous monster that rose from the waves. Okay, this is very important not only to the end of this novel, but also in the third novel, Acceptance. I won't say how it relates to either of them. I will just say that later on, there will be enormous monsters that rise from the waves or were a part of the waves. That's my only hint I will give you. Meanwhile, Surveyor just shrugs like, whatever. It would not answer the psychologist's question, such a thing for the surveyor to do. The anthropologist nodded as if she agreed with me. The entrance to the tower leading down exerted a kind of presence, a blank surface that let us write so many things on it. In other words, because it's so unfamiliar, so unknown, so weird and odd, that they could put any kind of understanding to it based on what it is that they wanted to imagine. Again, that's why she talks about being subjective versus objective. No matter how hard you try to be as objective as you want to be, you are still going to be subjective, right? This presence manifested like a low grade fever pressing down on all of us. For some reason, they're very anxious or perhaps even nervous about what's going on, right? It'd be like, okay, so there's a pit. Let's go inside and see what's inside. Some people are going to be like, I don't know about that. That seems a little bit odd to me. And then here is my favorite thing. I love when the psychologist loves to kind of explain herself and try not to explain things that Vandermeer should have done himself, which is, I would tell you the names of the other three if it mattered, but only the surveyor would last more than the next day or two. Besides, we were always strongly discouraged from using names. We were meant to be focused on our purpose, and anything personal should be left behind. Names belong to where we had come from, not to who we were while embedded in Area X. All right, very important here. Vandermeer knows that the reader is like, hey, what are the names of these people? We really want to know. But what is this excuse? It doesn't matter. And again, he foreshadows what's going to happen. The surveyor would only last the next day or two. Only the surveyor would survive. So, a lot of people are going to die in this book. Sad to say. And we were meant to be focused on the purpose of the expedition But what is the purpose? Wasn't it to be an observer? And didn't Vandermeer already mention they're not observers? So why are they really there? And it's very important when we're talking about identity, and many of you know this, when we call about national identity in particular, you've all studied this, right? In border studies, you've mentioned in your arguments, when you want to compare yourself from other people, you put a sort of national identity. I'm an American. So when you say the word American, many different words may come to your mind. You say, I'm a Californian, I'm an Angelino. So there's this sort of hidden meanings behind these sort of terms, right? Your name means something. But again, this is important for who you were. But now we're focusing mainly on Area X. So this is where the excerpt ends, which is on page 9. So it ends on page 9. And as you can probably see here, there is a little sort of feather here. Whenever there's a feather, that means it's going to either be the next day or she's going to sort of switch topics, right? So the Vandermeer and the biologist are very good at doing this. And also you will see in certain instances as well that there will be a sort of break that won't have this, it won't have the leaf, but it will have a sort of break in the paragraph. That usually means things are about to switch over or something else has happened. So we're going to talk about the next part in a second, which is pages 9 to 11, and then we will go from there. So if you have any questions about this, please let me know. So, very important here on page 9. Originally, our expedition had number 5 and included a linguist. Wait, what? So why is she mentioning this 5th person now? Why didn't she mention it originally and say, well, we had 5 people, but only 4 showed up? To reach the border, we each had to separate in a bright white room with the door at the far end and a single metal chair in the corner. I'm sorry, this just reminds me of an aside in this movie called Downsizing. And in this case, it's about a guy who wants to shrink himself, right? He has to go in a separate room for males, and his wife goes into a separate room for females. That's when you find out, after he's already shrank himself, that his wife freaked out and decides not to do it. And he's like, what? What do you mean you haven't done it? I'm like 2 inches tall now. Why? Woe is me. So I already figured that in this case, there's a sort of indication that something happened, and for some reason the linguist perhaps had chickened out. So I can only assume that based off of what I know. Let's find out. And the chair had holes for straps, the implications raised by a prickle of alarm, but by then I was set in my determination to reach Area X. Okay, so she's kind of indicating that yes, perhaps the linguist will chicken out or not decide to go. However, the question is, why is the biologist so determined to go to Area X? And one of the things I find interesting is that she repeats different sort of reasons as to why she wants to stay into Area X and why she wants to go there. However, some of these are sort of cover-ups for the real reason, which we find out a little bit later towards the end of chapter 4 and definitely in chapter 5. Won't spoil the details yet, but let's just say it's personal. Okay, so at some point the psychologist visited each of us, although I do not remember what was said. Again, my understanding of this, and again, this is why I've written it down for myself, is I put conditioning and mind control. So in my mind, I'm thinking the psychologist, the reason why she doesn't remember what was said is because the psychologist might have hypnotized her and told her What I am saying now, you will not remember when you wake up. So, are you ready to go? Oh, yeah, let's go. Okay? So that's the sort of idea behind this. And again, the psychologist had greeted us, but the linguist never appeared. Now, always question what the psychologist says. You can write that down. She had second thoughts, the psychologist told us, meeting our questions with a firm gaze. Yes, yes, that's right. She decided to have second thoughts. Yes, that's exactly what happened. She's not going like, oh, yeah, yeah. She didn't want to come. Usually, and this is psychologists know this very well, and even people in business. When you move your eyes around, especially in the interview, oftentimes this indicates that you're either thinking of something or you're probably not telling the truth. So oftentimes when you're at an interview, real life situation here, and even just in general, if you want to show someone or give them the impression that you're telling the truth, look at them in the eye and say, no, that did not happen. Yes, she had second thoughts, right? Being straight to the point with a firm gaze. She decided to stay behind. This came as a small shock because think about it. According to her, they've been through all this testing and all these different things, and then all of a sudden you say, oh, no, never mind. But then she says, this came as a relief. Of all our skill sets, linguists seemed, I like that word, linguists seemed at the time most expendable. But as we find out a little bit later, when they actually travel into the tunnel, this is going to be not good, right? That she wishes later on, oh my God, if only we had had the linguist. Okay, the psychologist says, now clear your minds. This meant she would begin the process of hypnotizing us so we could cross the border. She would then put herself under a kind of self hypnosis, which, as we find out later, I don't think she did, which is why she sort of freaks out later on in the novel. It had been explained that we would need to cross the border with precautions to protect against our minds tricking us. What? What do you mean? Apparently, hallucinations were common. At least this is what they told us. I no longer can be sure it was the truth. The actual nature of the border had been withheld from us for security reasons. We knew only that it was invisible to the naked eye. Okay, this is on page 10. Oh my goodness. For those of you who've done the border studies, you know the word security always deals with physical borders. It's a way of control, right? And one of the things that I find interesting is that the way that she is talking about this is she's using words like apparently and can be sure and actual, withheld, and invisible. These sort of words all indicate to me that she does not trust what she was told, right? That and the word seems was also used, I believe, a little bit further up. The idea of seeming or appearing to be one way means that something was told to them and that it might not have been true. And again, there's a sort of irony in the tone. At least this was what they told us. So, she now believes, now that she's seen further, that this probably was all a lie. That there were no hallucinations. That what they actually did see was a hallucination, but that the real picture of what really happened, they actually did not see. Very interesting. So when and she puts this in quotes, woke up, it was in full gear. How did they get ready? How did they arm themselves? Did the psychologist go like, well, you know what? I'm going to armor all my people and get them ready to go. That would take way too long. Somehow she manipulated them to do all this, right? And she says, I'm sorry. That was the least startling re-entry I could manage. Although later on, we see that the surveyor cursed and glared at her like, And she says, the biologist says, she had a temper. That must have been deemed an asset. Again, take note of this. She had a temper. The surveyor had a temper. That must have been deemed an asset or an essential trait to be a part of this expedition. The anthropologist got to her feet uncomplaining. Again, another one. Someone who is unflinching and someone who is willing to sort of overcome the odds and never complain. People love followers. People love people who never give up. Let me tell you, that's why I am where I am today. And I, as was my way, was too busy observing. So we got three different personalities here that you want to take note of. You have someone who is angry and very impetuous. The psychologist is uncomplaining. She's strong and she is a good follower. She doesn't complain. But then the third one, you have the observer, someone being objective and someone trying to solve a puzzle at every second of the way. In other words, instead of saying, or, whatever, she's like, wait a minute, but what about this and what about that? What if we do this and what if we do that? So her ability to sort of adapt to the situation is a very good asset. So we got three different assets here, which may be important for the final exam, so I'm going to repeat them one more time. Temper, uncomplaining, observant. Temper, uncomplaining, observant. So you got three right there. Good job. And here's something that is a motif while the psychologist is in this novel. At the bottom of page 11, for example, I noticed the cruelty of the almost imperceptible smile of the psychologist's lips as she watched us struggle to adjust. The anthropologist floundering, and apologizing for floundering. Later, I realized I might have misread her expression. It might have been pained or self-pitying. So it's very interesting, one, that the psychologist is observing, but when she's observing, she's doing it in a more subjective rather than objective way, right? And she's trying her best to do what a psychologist would, which is to read the sort of body language of the person. And she tries to do this several times with the psychologist, and she always gives at least two different answers, which tells me that the psychologist is not as objective as she says she is, but also that she is always observant, not just of the nature around her, but even around the people. Because she talks about the anthropologist and how the anthropologist is saying, like, oh, I'm sorry, it's really hard right now. I'm trying my best to adjust, right? And then she says, I might have misread the expression of the psychologist. So the psychologist is always like this. So is this like a sigh? Some people also do this. Yeah, that's really good. Yes, very good. So they keep their mouths open. They always look like they're smiling, things like that. Could be a little bit unnerving, right? But the idea is not only is the biologist unreliable, but she is being more subjective than objective. But she is doing so not because she is not objective in any way. It is because she is able to adapt. Remember, we talked about this, right? One of the big things is adaptation. The ability to adapt the way that you observe things. You're not going to be able to observe it objectively because she doesn't have case studies. She doesn't have the knowledge. So she can only go with her subjective, or what is sometimes called objective reasoning, which is where you give it your best shot based off of what you can see, right? So in this case, a lot is going on in that little short few sentences. Now, here's something important. I see the word unknown. I feel like I should be highlighting it. This is on page 11. Okay? And She says velvet ants and tiny emerald beetles crawled all over these sort of pebbles that are there, and scaly ridges of bark, bark being a tree, very big tree, rose on both sides, and the shadows of flying birds. Whew! Lots of birds, kind of like all the all the airplanes I'm listening to. The air was so fresh it buffeted the lungs, and we strained to breathe for a few seconds, mostly from surprise. Wow! I'm not sure if you've ever experienced this, but when you go to a place that doesn't have any smog, it's like a whole new world. You start to breathe in so much easier. It's actually kind of freaky at first, and vice versa. People who have gone from countries that have really good air to places that have a lot of smog, they start to sneeze more, they start to have coughing problems because they're unused to this sort of pollution, right? And then, after marking the location with a piece of red cloth tied to a tree, we began to walk forward into the unknown. Uh-oh. The word unknown is never a good thing, especially in stories like this where you're not sure what you are or where you're going. They usually mean something is going to happen. Not sure if it's going to be good or bad, but typically it doesn't end well. And so I'm going to stop here for now, except for one more thing in the final body paragraph just before this little feather here, which says, "We have been told not to look back upon arrival. Why? But I snuck a glance anyway. I don't quite know what I saw. It was hazy, indistinct, and already far behind us. Perhaps a gate, perhaps a trick of the eye. Just a sudden impression of a fizzing block of light fast fading. Oh my goodness. Is this a portal to another world? I don't know, but it sure sounds like it to me. And we're going to talk about a little bit further what happens next. So take a break, and then we'll see what this next part is all about, starting on the end of page 11. This next part, I'm going to try to get to the wild boar incident on page 15. Let's get started.